Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host. My name is Keith, and today is Wednesday. Right? Today's Wednesday. Checking my cellular device. Today is indeed Wednesday. Generally have been having a little bit of a hard time keeping track of what day it is. If I'm being super honest. It's just, everything's kind of running together lately between COVID and then all of the other things that have been going on in the news. It just feels like every day is a whole new form of, disaster. I'm sure 90% of podcast hosts are mentioning this, so probably just beating a dead horse there. But this week, this Wednesday, we are talking about another Phillip K Dick based piece of work, which is unsurprising considering this is a podcast about sci-fi. And that is going to be a movie. It's actually one that's pretty recent, which I think is, cool. It came out in 2006. It was directed by Richard Linklater. I believe that he's done some other things that he is relatively famous for. I'm not totally sure if I know any of them off the top of my head. He's got some Oscar nominations. Good for him, which is pretty cool. Let's see. It looks like he might be known for Boyhood. Oh, I actually saw that film. Boyhood is a really, really good movie. If you guys are looking for something, I don't know if I want to call it sad, but yeah, it's definitely really, really good. Oh, apparently he did School of Rock. So that would be how you know him. It stars Robert Downey Jr., Robert Downey Jr., Keanu Reeves, and Winona Ryder are kind of like the major... and Woody Harrelson, which is awesome. So they're a pretty star-studded cast, actually. And it is basically... It's not super science fiction-y. It's relatively science fiction-y. Just because it's not too far in the distant future. It's in the near future. It's filmed with something called like rotoscope animation or something like that. The whole movie is kind of like if a-ha's Take On Me music video was in color, is how I would describe it. The intention was for it to look like a comic book movie, like a graphic novel film. They did a pretty good job with that. But there's some other reasons why I think that the animation style was conducive to the stylistic choices of the movie, or the film, rather. So next week we'll probably talk about the book, because this is also a book, as are most Phillip K Dick things, books and movies. If you remember, we spent quite a bit of time talking about Blade Runner and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, so might end up doing that again, because I really, really did enjoy this film. It is a trip, is the way I would describe it. If you go into it kind of knowing what to expect out of the visuals, then you'll be a very happy camper, in my opinion. If you can just kind of like let it go, it's definitely worth the watch. And Robert Downey Jr. is in it and is amazing, as is Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves does an excellent job. Woody Harrelson is pretty funny. And then there's a couple other like minor characters. Winona Ryder is in it, but not as much as Robert Downey Jr. is, and not as much as Keanu Reeves is. So it's a very interesting concept and very well executed. So basically, the general plot is that you follow the story of an undercover police officer who is attempting to break into like the supply chain of a large explicit? I don't know. A large drug dealer who's dealing with a specific drug called Substance D. And the D stands for a lot of different things. A lot of people will say that Substance D stands for substance death, because Substance D is this incredibly addictive pill that you take that just like, I don't even know if it gets you high. It just is kind of a thing. They didn't really describe what it's like to be on Substance D. They just say that you either are or you aren't on it, and that's how addictive it is. So it's really hard to break the habit, of course. And the drug causes substantial damage to your brain the more you take it. So the more tabs or pills you take of Substance D, the more brain damage that you get. And the way that Phillip K Dick portrays this describes this brain damage is that your left and right hemispheres will either stop communicating with each other or they'll start competing with each other, because you'll get damage in one of the two hemispheres. I think it's usually the right hemisphere. And so the other side will start competing, but then you've got this weird compensation thing happening, and so there's just a lot of complications to taking the drug in the first place. So we find out that Keanu Reeves is an undercover police officer whose real life name is Bob Aker, or his persona's name is Bob Aker, and he wears a suit that is like constantly changing how it looks. It basically is like a kind of like a hazmat suit, but it kind of like transforms. I don't know if I'd say transforms. It has a bunch of holographic projectors on it that cause it to look like a bunch of different things all at once, like different faces, different people, and things like that. So it's generally just a good disguise. And so he wears this whenever he's in the office, because he's a police officer. So whenever he's in the headquarters, he wears this suit so that nobody knows who he is. None of the cops get to know who he is, which is, I find to be interesting, and kind of doesn't really, I don't know if it makes as much sense as, well, I guess you wouldn't be able to hide yourself and wear the suit when you were being an undercover cop elsewhere. So it makes sense that none of the people that you work with would get to see who you are, just because it like creates liability issues, and because they're in Orange County, and I think they said like 20% of the population is addicted to this drug, so it goes pretty deep. It's a pretty substantial industry. So we open up with Keanu Reeves giving this speech to these people in the community who are concerned with the number of individuals who are addicted to Substance D. We start noticing that he's having a little bit of a break from reality. Well, actually, technically, we open up on a scene with like one of the minor characters who is hallucinating that he's got bugs crawling all over him. And so he catches all the bugs in a jar to take them to Robert Downey Jr., who's his dealer. And then he's just like generally hallucinating the entire time. And then realizes there were never any bugs in the first place. So all the bugs that he like put into the jar were totally useless, because they weren't ever really there. So, but Robert Downey Jr. kind of seems to already know this. Robert Downey Jr.'s character, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, he basically plays himself as a drug dealer in this movie, so not too far off from himself at the time. Came out in 2006. I'm not sure if that was before or after he got busted for doing cocaine. Either way, or whatever drug it was that he was doing. Either way, yeah, so we start out with that guy, and then we cut to Keanu Reeves' character, who is in the suit at a local gathering and basically starts kind of talking about how awful Substance D is. And that is really just not great for him because he's kind of hooked on it. And so he starts having this like break from reality. And so he gets called into the police station in order to go undergo like a medical checkup. And the interesting thing, this seems like something that Phillip K Dick does in like a lot of his films, is to have like these weird like checkups or psychological evaluations that are based off of like these seemingly benign interactions that we have with miscellaneous aspects of the reality around us that ultimately add up to whether or not we are sane. There's definitely a lot of similarities between this movie and this book, I'm sure, and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? There's even some mentions of similar themes, which I'll get into later. But he is undergoing these tests that are basically kind of like Rorschach tests or Rorschach blot tests, except for there's no wrong answer. Or no, sorry, there is a wrong answer. There's only one right answer. So it's not like you can see see generalized things. You're looking for a specific thing amongst certain numbers of lines. And so it's either like a right or wrong. It's like an absolute right or wrong, which I think is interesting that he mentions that like towards the beginning of the film, because a lot of like morality is kind of the lines of morality are kind of gray in this particular movie, which is, interesting for sure. And then we get introduced to Winona Ryder's character. We also find out that Bob Aker, who is Keanu Reeves' character, is seeing Winona Ryder's character, and he's having some trouble in the bedroom with her. They've been seeing each other for a long period of time. They're very affectionate with each other. She is quoted as being his girl, but they're not sleeping together. So there's a little bit of contention surrounding that idea, which I'm sure is intentional on Phillip K. Dick's part. I can't think of a male author who writes about not feeling satisfied in that area who isn't currently not feeling satisfied in that area, or who hasn't. Just look at the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and The Wasteland, both by T.S. Eliot, and you'll get a pretty good example of what an angry author who is feeling unsatisfied writes about, and how he writes about it when it comes to that particular area of his life. But that's neither here nor there necessarily, just a funny observation. So we find out that Bob Aker, Keanu Reeves' character, is believed to be one of the higher ups in the whole like drug distribution network, but he gets like burner phones and things like that, and is able to call in and ask for drugs so that he can try to get himself to the top of the supply chain so that he can catch somebody who's like a little bit bigger fish than Robert Downey Jr.'s character, and a little bit bigger fish than Winona Ryder's character. At least that's what we think at the beginning of the film, is that Winona Ryder is supplying Keanu Reeves' character with drugs. So, because when he first gets out of the medical, he talks to his boss Hank, and then he goes to the medical bay where they do the tests, and he's doing tests throughout the film to figure out if he's sane still or not. Because basically what Substance D does is drive you pretty much crazy, because you've got all of these conflicts between your left and right hemispheres that make it really difficult for you to determine what is reality and what is not. And so he leaves and calls Winona Ryder's character to get some tabs of Substance D, and then we find out that there's some hints that Winona Ryder's character participates or does cocaine rather, and so they're just kind of talking about like the relative evil of different vices, which I found to be interesting because, like I said, there seems to be an indication that there is an absolute right and an absolute wrong that exists somewhere, and Phillip K. Dick, or the director, makes a big point to say that there is through the tests that Keanu Reeves goes through at the beginning of the film. But then we get this like moral gray area when it comes to drugs and addiction. So I found that to be very interesting. So we're going to take a quick commercial break, and then we're going to keep talking more about A Scanner Darkly.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Right before the break, I was just kind of talking about the gray area of morality that is emphasized in the film A Scanner Darkly, where kind of like, especially in the element, or in regard to like addiction and the interactions that individuals have with substance D. So the plot is pretty convoluted. The movie's very much a trip, so it's hard for me to kind of like walk through things without kind of taking some like side little rabbit trails. So, I'm just going to kind of like go for it. Try not to give away too many spoilers. Unfortunately, I don't think I can really talk about like the whole point of the film without giving away the twist at the end. So, yeah, definitely watch it. I think it's still worth watching even if you know the twist. In fact, I really kind of want to rewatch it now that I know the twist at the end. So don't be deterred from watching it or deterred from listening to the podcast. But, I mean, I would encourage you. It's only $3 to rent on Google, and it's totally worth it. I had a really great time watching it. It really is just like a trip and a journey. So but that's neither here nor there necessarily. I think it's the fourth time I've said that this podcast. I feel like I have a lot of things that I do or say that are these weird idiosyncrasies on this podcast that either make you love it or hate it. It's hard being the only host. I said this last week too, which again, me repeating myself, I apologize. It's hard being the only host. When I go to re-listen to these episodes, I feel like a professor, but I don't even have the opportunity to ask questions of my class, which is more than a little bit frustrating. But it is what it is. I enjoy doing this podcast, so it's just kind of funny to, not belabor. It's just kind of funny to talk about what it was like having a co-host. It was just more of a social thing. But regardless, so in the film, we meet Keanu Reeves, we meet everybody, we meet the main players, the Woody Harrelson's character, Robert Downey Jr.'s character. There's a guy named Frank, who is the addict that we meet at the very beginning of the film, who was kind of like in and out of everything pretty quickly. There's a lot of just like kind of drug movie antics in this film, which I found to be done in a refreshing way because of the stylistic choices made by the director and the producers, which, is a good thing overall. So we meet Winona Ryder's character. We meet Keanu Reeves' character. We realize that Keanu Reeves' character, Bob Akert, is being investigated by the police based off of a tip from a source that we eventually find out is Robert Downey Jr., which is really kind of wacky. So this is why the movie is such a trip. When we first start the film, and Keanu Reeves is talking to his boss, Hank. They make a statement that, like, nobody knows who anybody is in their department, all for safety reasons, because if one of them gets caught, then they would know everything, and so by none of them knowing anybody, no one can get caught and no one can find out. I think there might be some higher-ups who do have information on certain things, especially when you take into account what is seemed to be known at the end of the film. Then it ultimately it makes sense that someone would have to know what was going on in some capacity. So, regardless, another thing that I say frequently, Keanu Reeves is told, like, hey, you need to, this house that you're in, that we know you're in, but we don't know which of these people you are, is going to go under full surveillance because we got a tip saying that one of the people in this house is a major dealer. He's a major supplier, rather. And so what we find out is that Bob Acre is Keanu Reeves, and Keanu Reeves' character is being put under full-time surveillance at this house, which used to be Keanu Reeves' family's house. So he used to have a family and have 2 little girls and was married, and either his job required it of him or some other thing. I would guess there's more about this in the book than there is in the film. But he just eventually ended up being in a place where either his wife left him and took the kids, or he only has the memory of having children and a wife because of the brain damage caused by substance D. One of the reasons that I really liked the stylistic choice of the film is that you kind of feel like you are yourself addicted to this substance, because one of the things that happens when you get addicted to it is, aside from hallucinations, is that your ocular nerve and the optic center of your brain start to malfunction. So things don't look how they're supposed to look. So the fact that this is all in like rotoscope, to me, is really interesting because it makes it pretty like obvious that well, I don't know if I'd say it makes it obvious. It makes it pretty easy for you to kind of immerse yourself in the world because you are kind of participating in some capacity in the same issues that the addicts are facing, because your optic nerve or your optics are seemingly like different than what they would normally be. So I really appreciated that about the stylistic choice of the film, and really enjoyed what it brought to the table as far as the experience of the film is concerned. Now, to get kind of back on track here, Keanu Reeves' character is kind of, we're not really sure, he's kind of an unreliable narrator is the best way that I could describe it. He kind of modulates between like perceiving the truth and perceiving like these weird hallucinations, oftentimes involving bugs, which is a thing that Phillip K Dick loves to use in seemingly all of his stories. He likes to involve bugs or insects or spiders in some capacity. I think that for science fiction purposes, bugs are really great because they kind of represent this like odd little force of nature that has like specific roles and like just the right amount of creepiness to it for us to still feel like it's accessible, but it's also kind of terrifying. And when you really think about bugs, they are kind of this really funky thing in the world. So it definitely is interesting, to say the least. And so, after Keanu Reeves' character is told that the house is going to be under full surveillance, he is directed to this station where he's supposed to go and like edit anything out that would indicate to the investigators that he is Bob Acre, and he's also supposed to review all of the footage so that he can like present, so that they can have a case that will stick against Bob Acre. And that's something that they emphasize quite a lot. I would guess that in the book there's a little bit more commentary on like law enforcement and things like that, just because that is something that I think is really important to Phillip K. Dick, is commenting on how law enforcement handles the specifics of, drug addicts and addiction and things like that. Because ultimately a lot of what this film is about is the evolving way at which we kind of have to look at addiction and drugs with like the ever-changing landscape of technology and the the potency of those drugs. I was literally just struggling to find the word for how to phrase potency, but I was like, potentitude? Potential to So the potency of those drugs. Because as we get more advanced technologically and have a better understanding of the mind and of psychology, what we're finding is that ultimately, there are a lot more chemicals that can be much more addictive than what we would normally be, accustomed to, for lack of another word. It seems to me like Phillip K. Dick is kind of trying to say, like, look, all vices are kind of like equal in the end, but ultimately some are much more damaging than others. And so do we try to outlaw the ones that are much more damaging? Do we try to fight against them? Do we only fight against them if there's something like, if there's some industry that exists to take advantage of the individuals who are addicted to them? Like, how do we go about handling realistically the interactions that individuals have with these drugs? So, yeah, it's definitely got a lot to say about those particular things. And so I think that the way in which the interactions with like the law enforcement and the addicts are portrayed is very intentional, both on the director's part and on Phillip K. Dick's part. Just want to point out that we are yet again following a cop in a science fiction novel, which I think is hilarious because Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep followed a bounty hunter who worked for the police force, and here we are following yet another cop who works for like an enforcement agency, and I don't remember what total, we can recall it for you, or we can remember it for you wholesale, is another individual who gets involved with some sort of law enforcement agency, like the federal government law enforcement. So I think it's kind of interesting that Phillip K. Dick seems to have this, he seems to be kind of enamored with law enforcement in general. So, and with like the idea of rules, regulations, and how those things evolve over time. So I'm sure that there's some specific commentary that's being made here. Ultimately, the film doesn't have time to go over everything that I'm sure the book will. I haven't even looked into how long the book actually is, but I'm fairly certain that it's probably similar in length to Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. So Keanu Reeves' character, we find out that he believes himself to have had a family in this house in this suburban area, which it's weird that this house gets to exist without the cops constantly being called there, because when they show like a full shot of the neighborhood, their house looks kind of out of place. It's just like very disheveled, and there's constantly drug addicts out in front of it, like these dudes who are always strung out on drugs and meeting there to do drugs. The house is filthy and infested with pests. The yard is unkempt, and there's some indication that there were kids in the house at some point. So that definitely is interesting and worthy of note. But it's what's even more interesting is that this other undercover cop doesn't like go undercover and then go home. Like his home is his undercover. So work is equally undercover to everything else, because nobody at work knows who he is except for like the doctors and the much higher ups who work in like different departments, who know who has clearance and who doesn't. Which it's interesting that like the other undercover officers don't know each other, and they have a command structure there, but other individuals within the station have knowledge of who each individual is and have knowledge of like medical test results and things like that, which I found to be very interesting because it creates a really weird dynamic between, like, Hank, who is Bob Acre's boss. I don't remember what Bob Acre's name is outside of Bob. I can't remember what his police officer name is, but Hank is his boss's name. And so when Hank interacts with Keanu Reeves' character, it creates this interesting dynamic where you as like the viewer are kind of like, well, I know that like Bob Acre is not a big time drug dealer. He's just kind of like a guy who's involved with these other drug addicts. He's kind of trying to work his way up the ladder of finding, you know, the big guy, the big dealer. And so he just has a bunch of substance D that he's getting hooked on because it's being supplied to him because he, you know, is supposed to be undercover. So he kind of feels obligated to take the drugs. He gets hooked on those drugs, which is much less than advantageous. But that's not really relevant necessarily, at least not yet. So, yeah, the dichotomy that would normally exist between like being in disguise and being who you really are is kind of blurred because Keanu Reeves' character is always in disguise, even when he's interacting with people that he knows or people that are like doctors and things like that. Like they know who he is, but they aren't involved in the case, so he's still kind of hiding something from them, as well as hiding something from his boss, as well as hiding something from the people that he interacts with every day. So there's just constantly this like shroud of deceit that kind of rests very heavily over the top of everything in the film. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about A Scanner Darkly.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Film, A Scanner Darkly, and we're about halfway through the plot description. Probably kind of hard to follow through all of the random little, I guess, side tracks and rabbit trails that we've been going down throughout the podcast, but that's kind of how the film feels too. I did notice one particular thing that I'm not sure how I feel, or you know, if I liked it or if I didn't like it. There was this clear distinction between when Phillip K, or when you could tell that the script was like a screenwriter, and then that screenwriter was pulling text directly from Phillip K Dick, from the novel. And I haven't read the novel, so this is just a guess. But there was just certain times where the tone of the movie changed like very dramatically, at kind of like the drop of a hat, and what that says to me is like, oh, now we're quoting direct source material. So, yeah, I don't know. I would guess that that's kind of intentional because, I don't know, it's probably supposed to make you feel even more, like, mentally unstable. I think a big portion of this film is trying to make the viewer feel mentally unstable, which is kind of like, I don't know, it's supposed to contribute to the sense of paranoia because everybody who's in the film is constantly paranoid. So the very beginning of the film, the addict who we see, who believes there's bugs on him, believes that he's getting pulled over by the police even though the police aren't pulling him over. And so he like turns and parks thinking that the cop is going to pull him over and get out of the car, but the cop just drives right on by. So we don't really know if the cop was ever like pulling him over or if the guy was just hallucinating the entire time or what have you. And then we find out about Robert Downey Jr.'s character, and he is the one who is informing the police that Bob Baker, who is Keanu Reeves' character, is a major dealer. And so they have this belief that's planted by Robert Downey Jr.'s character, planted into the station, into the law enforcement, that Bob Baker is like a big-time dealer. And so there is this kind of like weird dichotomy of paranoia that's happening here, where Keanu Reeves is curious as to whether or not the people who he works for know that he's Bob Baker, or if Robert Downey Jr.'s character knows that he is an undercover cop. So there's just all this confusion and like subterfuge going on between these two groups. And the major indicator that Robert Downey Jr.'s character might know that he's being watched is that he is alone at Keanu Reeves' house during the day, and Woody Harrelson's character starts to choke. And Robert Downey Jr. is there and does nothing to help him at all. And Keanu Reeves is watching this unfold. And he's about to call Robert Downey Jr. when Robert Downey Jr. calls the paramedics. And so Keanu Reeves can't call. But then Keanu Reeves gets a call immediately from Winona Ryder's character, which I think is really interesting because, yeah, well, there's a big twist at the end of the film. We'll get to it at the last section. I'm going to give the twist away at the end of the podcast, just so you know. So after our next commercial break, I will be talking about the major twist at the end of the film, and it will make more sense as to why it's interesting that Winona Ryder's character calls when she does after Keanu Reeves is about to call about Robert Downey Jr.'s character. So the fact that Robert Downey Jr.'s character doesn't do anything, it kind of indicates that he is aware that someone is watching him, and he's trying to figure out maybe like who it is, or if someone's like immediately available to stop him. And what we find out is that all of his accusations about Bob Baker are ultimately like synthetic. He like home makes recordings that trying to make it seem like Keanu Reeves' character Bob Baker is involved with some sort of like terrorist organization that's going to poison the water supply. So that is definitely, I don't know, it's interesting, I guess, would be the best way to phrase it. Because at the time we don't know why it is that Robert Downey Jr.'s character would be motivated to bust Bob Baker. And I think it's because ultimately Robert Downey Jr.'s character knows that Bob Baker is an undercover police officer. He's been giving him more tabs of substance D more frequently. It seems like he's intentionally trying to make the man become unstable. And so he is kind of like this murderer by proxy, which is exactly how Keanu Reeves describes him prior to Keanu Reeves kind of like going even crazier from the substance D. So Keanu Reeves says like he doesn't ever actually murder anybody, but he's just in proximity to these people who end up having their lives destroyed by him. And I think that Robert Downey Jr.'s character is kind of supposed to be a metaphor for drugs in the first place. Because it's not like the drugs actually really kill anybody. It's the people who take the drugs not being able to control themselves when they're taking the drug that kills them. So like, it's kind of like, you know, like, do guns kill people or do people kill people? Well, we know that people kill people and they use guns. And drugs don't kill people. People kill people and they use drugs. And I think that's kind of what Phillip K. Dick is trying to get at with the way that, or the director's trying to get at with the way that Robert Downey Jr.'s character is portrayed. Because it's not like it's really Robert Downey Jr. who's actively killing anybody, but he is actively ensuring that other people are going to experience very negative things in their life just by being in association with him. And then another interesting thing that kind of occurs about the 3/4 mark through the movie is that Fred, our addict from the very beginning of the film, ultimately decides to take his own life by overdosing on substance D. But I don't think that substance D kills you. I think that it just kind of puts you into, like, it kills your brain, so you're brain dead. You're not really dead. And I think that that's why it's called substance D for substance death, because ultimately what Phillip K. Dick is trying to say is that, like, your body could die, but that would be a best case scenario for most drug addiction. Most drug addiction just destroys your mind, and your mind is ultimately more of yourself than your body is. So you'd be lucky to actually die, but drugs aren't that much of a blessing. They're not that good of a thing that they would kill you. Because when Fred goes to, or Frank, I can never remember his name. I'm so bad with names on these podcasts, and I'm very sorry. Goes to kill himself by overdosing. There's this really hilarious exchange of, like, this narration of saying, like, on this day, Fred decided to take his own life by overdosing on substance D because of all the paranoia associated with it, and he's just freaking out, and he can't do it anymore, and it would be easier to be dead. So he decides that he's going to dress really nicely, he's going to do all these things, and he's going to drink a cheap bottle of wine. But then he decides he's going to make a statement, and instead buys an expensive bottle of wine, drinks a couple glasses, takes all of his pills, and hopes to die. And then realizes that instead of dying, what has happened is an interdimensional being has appeared in his room to read him his sins for eternity, which is, like, obviously a reference to some sort of mythology. It has 1,000 eyes, which, unfortunately off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that would fit that description in, like, a generally well-known mythos, but I'm sure that it exists. So obviously there's a religious reference. Gosh, why am I struggling so much with my words today? There's a religious reference in there that is pretty blatantly obvious. And the narrator says that the list of his sins will be unending. So, and then says that after the first 100 years of having his sins read to him, they had just gotten to the 6th grade, which is when Frank had discovered masturbation. So, it's definitely a very funny and, like, comical scene about a very, very dark bit of subject matter. But I think ultimately that's kind of what Phillip K. Dick is trying to say about drugs, is that, like, they do these weird things to you, and then, like, ultimately he's talking in, like, existential prose here about, what does death look like? What does brain death look like? What does eternity look like if you feel, or if you've done, like, wrong in some capacity? I'm not entirely sure how exactly what exactly he's trying to portray in that regard of whether or not something was wrong or right. But the fact that this list of sins is unending is probably commentary on, like, God and religious views in the first place of, like, what is important to those individuals. And there is a lot of reference, maybe not a lot, but there's a couple references to God that are very meaningful in this film. And actually there's probably 3 primary references. There's one with Frank, or Fred, F.R. first name, I can't remember his whole name. And then Keanu Reeves mentions God a little bit later in the film, when he is going through the house and kind of thinking about how the house is it's being wasted on these drug addicts. The house, it has all of this potential to have, like, a family in it and to have these meaningful things in it, and ultimately it just has a bunch of, like, junkies in it who aren't really doing anything with their lives. They're not adding to society. In fact, they're actively detracting from it because either Robert Downey Jr. or Bob Acre are dealers. And so they're perpetuating this cycle of addiction within their community, which when we first meet Keanu Reeves' character, he is addressing the community about the problem that is provided or caused by Substance D's presence in their community. So there is definitely some conflict there. Like, Keanu Reeves, we can kind of tell that he at some point was or desires to be again a family man in some regard, because he, like, if I just had to guess based on the way that his character is portrayed, to me it kind of seems like those values are somewhat important to him in some regard or another. So But we have a hard time, and I think he has a hard time knowing what it is that he really wants, and we have a hard time knowing what it is that he really wants, because everything is obscured. And that is kind of, the suits that change faces constantly serve a dual purpose of, one, representing the fact that everyone is always wearing a mask of some sort to kind of disguise themselves from the world around them and prevent people from seeing them who they really are. But it also serves as kind of like a metaphor to help us realize how Keanu Reeves' character feels about himself, how Bob Baker feels about himself. Because ultimately, Bob Baker is never himself around anybody. He's not himself around his romantic interest, Winona Ryder, whose name is Tracy, I want to say. He's not himself around his quote-unquote friends, because he's ultimately there to put his friends in jail for dealing drugs or doing drugs. And he's not himself around his boss, because his boss is ultimately telling him that the person who he is portraying, Bob Baker, is being investigated. So there's just like multiple levels of like acting and subterfuge and paranoia here that help to contribute to the fact that, like, and I think this is again supposed to kind of put us in the shoes of like an addict, where like things are just confusing and they don't make sense anymore because they're so convoluted by unnecessary complication. And I think that is part of the director's goal in the way in which it's portrayed, is to kind of make you feel like you yourself aren't really sure of who to be suspicious of and who is worthy and who is like someone that you can trust. So yeah, and ultimately that whole thing gets swept out from underneath you with the kind of like twist at the end, which I'm going to talk about finally right after this next commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Podcast. You finally get to know the twist to this film. I can't really talk about the important aspects of the film and of the philosophy behind it without giving away spoilers. So, yeah. Again, I want to watch this a second time after knowing what I know now, so I really don't think that it deters from or detracts from your ability to enjoy the film, to know the spoiler. In fact, if you're watching it with somebody else and they don't know but you do, it would be even more fun. So I'll definitely probably try to do that at some point as well. I just generally like to see how many viewpoints from which I can view a quality piece of art. So at the end of the film, what we find out is that Robert Downey Jr.'s character is in fact the major drug dealer that the police officers are after. But they don't have anything, as far as charges are concerned, that would stick him to the crime. So they can take him in, arrest him, pretty much do whatever they want. It's not going to matter because ultimately he's just going to kind of get away with things because they don't have any charges that will actually stick to him. And that's made pretty clear by the police chief, or by Keanu Reeves' boss, whose name is Hank. What we also find out is that Keanu Reeves' character is heavily addicted to substance D. So much so that he's experiencing substantial amounts of brain damage from the taking of substance D. We also find out that his boss Hank is in fact Winona Ryder's character. which that's a big reveal that I was really not expecting. I thought that that Keanu Reeves' boss Hank was going to end up being Robert Downey Jr., and so the whole thing was just kind of this like weird farce, which it kind of ends up being a farce because the police station or the law enforcement knew that Bob Aker was their undercover cop the whole time, and knew and watched him get addicted to Substance D because they were watching the surveillance outside of him doing any of his editing. He was being tracked outside of any of it, like anything that he would normally be accustomed to being tracked with. They let him get addicted to Substance D in order to put him even further undercover, because what you find out at the end of the film is that there's a suspicion of the police department that the primary place where recovering addicts are supposed to go in order to do their rehab, the primary place that does that, New Haven, they believe that New Haven is actually the primary producer of Substance D. And what New Haven is essentially doing is getting a bunch of people hooked on this drug that destroys their mind to the point of almost complete and total subservience, and then is using those individuals to farm more Substance D, sell Substance D, and then also charge individuals for their rehab, because of course they would charge them for their rehab. So they're basically like quadruple dipping into the entire industry of Substance D. So they're not only are they selling, but they're growing and providing, and then they're taking advantage of individuals who have become so addicted that they can't take care of themselves anymore by using them as basically slave labor. And so this is the suspicion that the police or that law enforcement has, but they don't have anyone on the inside who can get a hold of evidence that would lead to a trial against New Haven. Because New Haven does a really good job of making sure that they hide this specific flower from which Substance D is created. So if I had to guess, Substance D is supposed to be kind of like heroin in some capacity, highly addictive, causes hallucinations, and there's a lot of people who are using it in broad daylight who we don't even know are using it. So, and ultimately it like destroys your mind and your body, because getting addicted to it and getting off of it causes just as much damage as being on it does. So you're kind of danged if you do, danged if you don't. What we find out is that this suspicion is actually true. But the police officers don't know this, and Winona Ryder's character does genuinely care for Keanu Reeves' character, even though they were both undercover cops, and one of them is his superior. It's just part of the reason why I don't think that she was, or why I think she wasn't sleeping with him. And we get this like kind of inkling that maybe Winona Ryder's character is sleeping with Keanu Reeves, because he starts like believing that he sees her in bed with him, which, based off of the technology that is available, I wouldn't be surprised if Winona Ryder's character does in fact sleep with Keanu Reeves in disguise, just based off of the level of technology that is available, and the fact that she does seem to genuinely care about Keanu Reeves' character. Because at the end of the film, she's talking to what seems to be one of her superiors, or another person who's involved in this particular case, in this grand scheme, if you will, who's saying, like, you know, it really sucks that Bob had to go down, and that he got addicted to Substance D. And Winona Ryder's character says, we got him addicted to Substance D so that he would have the brain damage that would allow for him to be put into the rehab facility and then transferred to the agricultural portion of the rehab facility, because the agricultural portion of the rehab facility is the only place where they're going to be able to get the evidence that would actually they could use to charge New Haven with. But New Haven keeps everything on such tight lockdown that they can't get anybody out to the fields or the farms where the individuals who are in the rehab program are actually working. So you have to basically have so much substantial or so much brain damage that you're kind of basically like a domesticated, like just fully, like you're biologically functioning, but mentally you are not there in any capacity. And so what we find out is that Keanu Reeves' character has in fact experienced so much brain damage that he no longer is really able to function normally in any capacity. He is completely submissive and subdued, has no idea of what reality looks like, and kind of lives in his own little world. And the end of the film is a lot of us like trying to figure out whether or not Keanu Reeves is going to be able to come through at the end and like get the evidence back to the place where he needs to get it to so that there can be a conviction, and so that they can bring a case against New Haven. But in talking about, you know, the process of getting Keanu Reeves or Bob Baker that deep into the system, they kind of have this moral conundrum of like, okay, well, what is it that we, like, what have we really done here? Is there anybody who's going to think, like, well, aren't we kind of evil for watching this man go from being like a family man to a complete and total addict to like a useless, like, invalid, basically, who has like all of his biological functions but none of his cognitive functions? Like, we basically turned him into a zombie. And is that going to be worth it in the end? And they kind of start talking about how, like, you know, if God doesn't have to be morally acceptable by the majority of individuals, then why is it that humans expect themselves to be held to a higher standard? They also start talking about like the value of things in regards to like a utilitarian sense, you know? So is the life of one man worth saving all of these other potential addicts that would get hooked on this substance after, or that will get hooked on the substance because of substance, who will get hooked on substance D because of New Haven's tampering with the market for it? So they're just kind of going back and forth about whether or not they should feel good about that. They talk about what it's going to look like for their children's children, and the fact that substance D is this like pernicious drug that just weaves its way into individuals' lives and then like leeches off of them indefinitely. So there's a lot of, you know, conjecture by the two of them about whether or not this is purposeful and whether or not it matters and whether or not there's even a chance that it will work. And I would say that the film does end generally hopefully. But something that really kind of impacted me that I want to talk about at like the end of the whole film was that I think that Phillip K. Dick actually wrote this novel as part of inspiration for people that he had lost to addiction. And one of the major things in this film that they kind of talk about is like that you're either addicted or not. And I think that maybe addicted could be changed to like addict or something along those lines. And I think that the director is trying to make, and Phillip K. Dick are both trying to make statements about what it is, like what is the human element of addiction? What causes people to kind of like go down this path and to not return? And the major theme that we see in Keanu Reeves' life is this lack of satisfaction. In fact, the thing that he says causes people to get hooked on substance D is that reality is unsatisfactory to them because it ultimately feels bland and useless and stagnant is like a word that he uses frequently. When he talks about what happened with his kids and his wife and his like change of career path, he says specifically that his life was stagnant and that he felt bored constantly and that nothing he did felt like it really mattered or had purpose. And so here's this individual who is feeling all these things, who ends up having this very grand purpose within the scheme of other individuals, which, again, probably commentary on the idea of God, and how, like, you know, if there is a God and predestination does exist, then, like, you kind of, like, have this illusion of feeling like you have choice, but you really don't because somebody else has been making the choice for you the entire time, which is kind of exactly what happened to Keanu Reeves' character. Anyway, rabbit hole. So he ends up switching things up because he feels so stagnant, and then also ends up getting hooked on substance D, which, like, I can't remember. He goes on this whole diatribe of what the D stands for at the very beginning of the film, and he ends it by saying D stands for death. But there's a lot of like things about abandonment and disillusionment and things that are kind of just like speaking to the fact that ultimately individuals who are taking drugs are doing so to frequently escape from something that exists within their mind and not something that exists within reality. And so they're just kind of trading one crisis for another rather than doing anything constructive about about the potential outcomes of their lives as individuals. And so I think that what Phillip K. Dick is kind of trying to get at here is that, and what the director is probably also trying to get at here, is that it's really just genuinely not easy to help individuals who are kind of mired in this addiction, because they genuinely are. There's more than just the drugs going on with those individuals. There's a reason that they took the drugs in the first place, and quite frequently it is because of the general lack of satisfaction that they have in the world around them and in the blandness of everyday existence. And I think that it's a really accurate portrayal of like what drives a lot of people to drugs who have good lives otherwise, is ultimately that like nothing really feels satisfying and that ignorance is kind of bliss, and drugs can provide that in abundance, and substance D is like that. Ignorance is bliss in a weaponized form, because it literally destroys your ability to understand things in the world around you. So the drug not only gets you high while you're on it, but it gives you a permanent high in the end because you just are unaware and everything is handy dandy. And that is kind of how the film ends when with Keanu Reeves. Now, there are definitely some things in this film I didn't tell you about, so I do again highly recommend watching it. And unfortunately, it's streaming on a place called like Vudu, I want to say, for free. I rented it from Google just because I really wanted to see it. I don't mind paying for films. Somebody paid to make it, I'll pay to watch it. So, highly recommend checking this one out. And maybe checking the book out. I know I'm going to check the book out as well. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you for joining me. If you liked what you heard, definitely give us a like and a subscribe. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, all those good places. And I will see you guys again on Sunday. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.